1984, Part 2, Chapter 10. It's January 2025. Today is January 20th. Today is Inauguration Day. Chapter 10. When he woke, it was with the sensation of having slept for a long time, but a glance at the old-fashioned clock told him that it was only 20:30. He lay dozing for a little while, then the usual deep-lunged singing struck up from the yard below. It was only an hopeless fancy, it passed like an April day. But a look and a word and the dreams they stirred, they've all stolen my heart away. The driveling song seemed to have kept its popularity. He still heard it all over the place. It had outlived the hate song. Julia woke to the sound, stretched herself luxuriously, and got out of bed. I'm hungry, she said. Let's make some more coffee. Damn, the stove's gone out and the water's cold. She picked the stove up and shook it. There's no oil in it. We can get some from Old Charrington, I expect. The funny thing is, I made sure it was full. I'm going to put my clothes on, she added. It seems to have got colder. Winston also got up and dressed himself. The indefatigable voice sang on. They say that time heals all things. They say you can always forget. But the smiles and the tears across the years, they twist your heartstrings yet. As he fastened the belt over his overalls, he strolled across to the window. The sun must have gone down behind the houses. It was not shining into the yard any longer. The flagstones were wet as though they had just been washed, and he had the feeling that the sky had been washed too. So fresh and pale was the blue between the chimney pots. Tirelessly, the woman marched to and fro, corking and uncorking herself, singing and falling silent and pegging out more diapers and more yet. He wondered whether she took in washing for a living or was merely the slave of 20 or 30 grandchildren. Julia had come across to his side. Together they gazed down with a sort of fascination at the sturdy figure below. As he looked at the woman in her characteristic attitude, her thick arms reaching up for the line, her powerful, mare-like buttocks protruded, it struck him for the first time that she was beautiful. It had never before occurred to him that the body of a woman of 50, blown up to monstrous dimensions by childbearing, then hardened, roughened by work till it was coarse in the grain like an overripe turnip, could be beautiful. But it was so, after all, he thought. Why not? The solid, contourless body, like a block of granite, and the rasping red skin bore the same relation to the body of a girl as the rose hip to the flower. Why should the fruit be held inferior to the flower? She's beautiful, he murmured. She's a meter across the hips easily, said Julia. That is her style of beauty, said Winston. He held Julia's supple waist, easily encircled by his arm. From the hip to the knee, her flank was against his. Out of their bodies, no child would ever come. That was one of the things he could never do. Only by word of mouth, from mind to mind, could they pass on the secret. The woman down there had no mind. She had only strong arms, a warm heart, and a fertile belly. He wondered how many children she had given birth to. It easily might be 15. She had her momentary flowering, a year perhaps, of wild rose beauty, and then she had suddenly swollen like a fertilized fruit and grown hard and red and coarse. And then her life had been laundering, scrubbing, darning, cooking, sweeping, polishing, mending, scrubbing, laundering, first for children, then for grandchildren, over 30 years. At the end of it, she was still singing. The mystical reverence that he felt for her was somehow mixed up with the aspect of the pale, cloudless sky stretching away behind the chimney pots into interminable distances. It was curious to think that the sky was the same for everybody, in Eurasia or Eastasia as well as here. And the people under the sky were also very much the same. Everywhere, all over the world, hundreds or thousands of millions of people just like this, people ignorant of one another's existence, held apart by walls of hatred and lies, and yet almost exactly the same. People who had never learned to think, but were storing up in their hearts and bellies the muscles, the power that would one day overturn the world. If there was hope, it lay in the proles. Without having read to the end of the book, he knew that must be Goldstein's final message. The future belonged to the proles, and he could be sure that when their time came, the world they constructed would not just be as alien to him, Winston thought, The world of the party? Yes, because at least it would be a world of sanity. I'm going to reread that sentence because I think I messed it up. And could he be sure that when their time came, the world they constructed would not be just as alien to him, Winston Smith, as the world of the party? Yes, because at least it would be the world of sanity. Where there is equality, there can be sanity. Sooner or later, it would happen. Strength would change into consciousness. The proles were immortal. You could not doubt it when you looked at that valiant figure in the yard. In the end, their awakening would come, and until that happened, though it might be 1,000 years, they would stay alive against all the odds, like birds passing on from body to body the vitality which the party did not share and could not kill. Do you remember, he said, the thrush that sang to us the first day at the edge of the wood? He wasn't singing to us, said Julia. He was singing to himself. Not even that. He was just singing. The birds sang. The proles sang. The party did not sing. All around the world, in London and New York, in Africa and Brazil, and in the mysterious forbidden lands beyond the frontiers, in the streets of Paris and Berlin, in the villages of the endless Russian plain, in the bazaars of China and Japan, everywhere stood the same solid, unconquerable figure made monstrous by work and childbearing, toiling from birth to death, and still singing. Out of those mighty loins, a race of conscious beings must one day come. You were the dead. Theirs were the future. But you could share in the future if you kept alive the minds as they kept alive the body. And passed on the secret doctrine that 2 plus 2 make 4. We are the dead, he said. We are the dead, echoed Julia dutifully. You are the dead, said an iron voice behind them. They sprang apart. Winston's entrails seemed to have turned into ice. He could see the white all around the irises of Julia's eyes. Her face had turned a milky yellow. The smear of rouge that was still on her cheekbone stood out sharply, almost as though unconnected with the skin beneath. You are the dead, repeated the iron voice. It was behind the picture, breathed Julia. It was behind the picture, said the voice. Remain exactly where you are. Make no movement until you are ordered. It was starting at last. They could do nothing except stand gazing into one another's eyes. To run for life, to get out of the house before it was too late? No such thought occurred to them. Unthinkable to disobey the iron voice from the wall. There was a snap as though a catch had been turned back and a crash of breaking glass. The picture had fallen to the floor, uncovering the telescreen behind it. Now they can see us, said Julia. Now we can see you, said the voice. Stand out in the middle of the room. Stand back to back. Clasp your hands behind your heads. Do not touch one another. They were not touching. But it seemed to him that he could feel Julia's body shaking. Or perhaps it was merely shaking of his own. He could just stop his teeth from chattering. But his knees were beyond his control. There was a sound of trampling of boots below, inside the house and outside. The yard seemed to be full of men. Something was being dragged across the stones. The woman singing had stopped abruptly. There was a long, rolling clang as though the wash tub had been flung across the yard. And then a confusion of angry shouts, which ended in a yell of pain. The house is surrounded, said Winston. The house is surrounded, said the voice. He heard Julia snap her teeth together. I suppose we may as well say goodbye, she said. You may as well say goodbye, said the voice. And then another quite different voice, a thin, cultivated voice, which Winston had the impression of having heard before, struck in. And by the way, while we are on the subject, here comes a candle to light you to bed. Here comes a chopper to chop off your head. Something crashed on the bed behind Winston's back. The head of a ladder had been thrust through the window and had burst in the frame. Someone was climbing through the window. There was a stampede of boots up the stairs. The room was full of solid men in black uniforms with iron-shod boots on their feet and truncheons in their hands. Winston was not trembling any longer. Even his eyes, he barely moved. One thing alone mattered, to keep still, and not give them an excuse to hit you. A man with a smooth prize fighter's jowl in which the mouth was only a slit, paused opposite him, balancing his truncheon meditatively between thumb and finger. Winston met his eyes. The feeling of nakedness, with one's hands behind one's head and one's face and body all exposed, almost unbearable. The man produced the tip of a white tongue, licked the place where his lips should have been, and then passed on. There was another crash. Someone had picked up the glass paperweight from the table and smashed it to pieces on the hearthstone. The fragment of coral, a tiny crinkle of pink-like sugar rosebud from a cake, rolled across the mat. How small, thought Winston. How small it always was. There was a gasp and a thump behind him. He received a violent kick of the ankle, which nearly flung him off his balance. One of the men had smashed his fist into Julia's solar plexus, doubling her up like a pocket ruler. She was thrashing about on the floor, fighting for breath. Winston dared not turn his head even by a millimeter, but sometimes her livid, gasping face came within the angle of his vision. Even in his terror, it was thought he could feel the pain in his own body, the deadly pain which nevertheless was less urgent than the struggle to get back her breath. He knew what it was like, the terrible, agonizing pain which was there all the while but could not be suffered yet, because before all else it was necessary to be able to breathe. The two of the men hoisted her up by knees and shoulders and carried her out of the room like a sack. Winston had a glimpse of her face, upside down, yellow and contorted, with the eyes shut, and still with a smear of rouge on either cheek. And that was the last he saw of her. He stood still. No one had hit him yet. Thoughts which came of their own accord but seemed totally uninteresting began to flit through his mind. He wondered whether they had got Mr. Charrington. He wondered what they had done to the woman in the yard. He noticed that he badly wanted to urinate and felt a faint surprise because he had done so only 2 or 3 hours ago. He noticed that the clock on the mantelpiece said 9, meaning 21, but the light seemed too strong. Would not the light be fading at 21 hours on an August evening? He wondered whether, after all, he and Julia had mistaken the time, had slept the clock round and thought it was 20:30, when really it was not 8:30 of the following morning. But he did not pursue the thought further. It was not interesting. There was another lighter step in the passage. Mr. Charrington came into the room. The demeanor of the black uniformed men suddenly became more subdued. Something also changed in Mr. Charrington's appearance. His eyes fell on the fragments of the glass paperweight. "Pick up those pieces," he said sharply. A man stooped to obey. The Cockney accent had disappeared. Winston suddenly realized whose voice it was that he had heard a few moments ago on the telescreen. Mr. Charrington was still wearing his old velvet jacket, but his hair, which had been almost white, had turned black. Also, he was not wearing his spectacles. He gave Winston a single sharp glance, as though verifying his identity, and then paid no more attention to him. He was still recognizable, but he was not the same person any longer. His body had straightened and seemed to have grown bigger. His face had undergone only tiny changes that had nevertheless worked a complete transformation. The black eyebrows were less bushy, the wrinkles were gone, the whole lines of his face seemed to have altered. Even the nose seemed shorter. It was the alert, cold face of a man of about 35. It occurred to Winston for the first time in his life. He was looking, with knowledge, at a member of the thought police. Part 3, Chapter 1. He did not know where he was. Presumably he was in the Ministry of Love, but there was no way of making certain. He was in a high-ceilinged, windowless cell with walls of glittering white porcelain. Concealed lamps flooded it with cold light, and there was a low, steady humming sound, which he supposed had something to do with the air supply. A bench or shelf, just wide enough to sit on, ran around the wall, broken only by the door, and at the end opposite the door, a lavatory pan with no wooden seat. There were 4 telescreens, one in each wall. There was a dull aching in his belly. It had been there ever since they had bundled him into the closed van and driven him away. But he was also hungry, with a gnawing, unwholesome kind of hunger. It might have been 24 hours since he had eaten. It might have been 36. He still did not know, probably never would know, whether it had been morning or evening when they arrested him. Since he was arrested, he had not been fed. He sat as still as he could on the narrow bench, with his hands crossed on his knees. He had already learned to sit still. If you made unexpected movements, they yelled at you from the telescreen. But the craving for food was growing upon him, and he longed for, above all, was just a piece of bread. He had an idea that were a few breadcrumbs in his pocket of his overalls, if it was even possible. He thought this because, from time to time, something seemed to tickle his leg, that there might be a sizable bit of crust there. In the end, the temptation to find out overcame him. He slipped a hand into his pocket. "Smith!" yelled a voice from the cell screen. 60079 Smith W. Hands out of pockets in the cells. He sat still again, his hands crossed on his knees. Before being brought here, he had been taken to another place, which must have been an ordinary prison or a temporary lockup used by the proles. He did not know how long he had been there, some hours at any rate. With no clocks and no daylight, it was hard to gauge the time. It was a noisy, evil-smelling place. They had put him into a cell similar to the one he was in now, but filthy, dirty, and at all times crowded with 10 to 15 people. The majority of them were common criminals, but there was a few political prisoners among them. He had sat silent against the wall, jostled by dirty bodies, too preoccupied by fear and the pain in his belly to take much interest in his surroundings, but still noticing the astonishing difference in demeanor between the party prisoners and the others. Party prisoners were always silent and terrified, but the ordinary criminals seemed to care nothing for anybody. They yelled insults at the guards, fought back fiercely with their belongings being impounded, wrote obscene words on the floor, ate smuggled food which they produced from mysterious hiding places in their clothes, and even shouted down the telescreen when it tried to restore order. On the other hand, some of them seemed to be on good terms with the guards, calling them by nicknames, and tried to wheedle cigarettes through a spy hole in the door. The guards, too, treated the common criminals with a certain forbearance, even when they had to handle them roughly. There was much talk about the forced labor camps to which most of the prisoners expected to be sent. It was all right in the camps, he gathered, as long as you had good contacts and knew the ropes. There were bribery, favoritism, and racketeering of every kind. There were homosexuality and prostitution. There was even illicit alcohol distilled from potatoes. The positions of trust were given only to the common criminals, especially the gangsters and the murderers, who formed a sort of aristocracy. All the dirty jobs were done by the politicals. There was a constant come and go of prisoners of every description: drug peddlers, thieves, bandits, black marketeers, drunks, prostitutes. Some of the drunks were so violent that the other prisoners had to combine to suppress them. An enormous wreck of a woman, aged about 60, with great tumbling breasts and thick coils of white hair, which had come down in her struggles, was carried in, kicking and shouting, by 4 guards who had hold of her at one of each corner. They wrenched off the boots with which she had been trying to kick them, and dumped her down across Winston's lap, almost breaking his thigh bones. The woman hoisted herself upright and followed them out with a yell of "Effing bastards!" Then noticed that she was sitting on something uneven and slid off Winston's knee onto the bench. "Beg pardon, dearie. I wouldn't have sat on you, only the buggers put me there." "They don't know how to treat a lady, do they?" She paused, patted her breast, and belched. "Pardon me, I ain't myself quite." She leant forward and vomited copiously on the floor. "That's better," she said, leaning back with her closed eye. "Never keep it down, that's what they say. Get it up while it's fresh on your stomach like." She revived, turned to have another look at Winston, and seemed immediately to take a fancy to him. She put a vast arm around his shoulder and drew him toward her, breathing beer and vomit into his face. "What's your name, dearie?" she said. "Smith," said Winston. "Smith?" said the woman. "That's funny, my name's Smith too." "Why," she added sentimentally, "I might be your mother." She might, thought Winston, be his mother. She was about the right age and physique, and it was probable that people changed somewhat after 20 years in forced labor camp. No one else had spoken to him. To a surprising extent, the ordinary criminals ignored the party prisoners, the pullets, they called them, with a sort of uninterested contempt. The party prisoners seemed terrified of speaking to anybody, and above all, of speaking to one another. Only once, when 2 party members, both women, were pressed close together on the bench, he overheard amid a din of voices a few hurriedly whispered words, and in particular a reference to something called Room 101, which he did not understand. Might be 2 or 3 hours ago that they had brought him here. The dull pain in his belly never went away, but sometimes it grew better and sometimes worse, and this thought expanded or contracted accordingly. When it grew worse, he thought only of the pain itself and of his desire for food. When it grew better, panic took hold of him. There were moments when he foresaw the things that would happen to him with such acute actuality that his heart galloped and his breath stopped. He felt the smash of truncheons on his elbows and iron-shaped boots on his arms. He saw himself groveling on the floor, screaming for mercy through broken teeth. He hardly thought of Julia. He could not fix his mind on her. He loved her and would not betray her. But that was only a fact, known as he knew the rules of arithmetic. He felt no love for her, and he hardly even wondered what was happening to her. He thought oftener of O'Brien with a flickering hope. O'Brien must know that he'd been arrested. The Brotherhood, he said, never tried to save its members, but there was a razor blade. They would send the razor blade if they could. There would perhaps be 5 seconds before the guards could rush into the cell. The blade would bite into him with a sort of burning coldness, and even the fingers that held it would be cut to the bone. Everything came back to his sick body, which shrank trembling from the smallest pain. He was not certain that he would use the razor blade even if he got the chance. It was more natural to exist from moment to moment, accepting another 10 minutes' life with the certainty that there was torture at the end of it. Sometimes he tried to calculate the number of porcelain bricks on the wall of the cell. It should have been easy, but he always lost count at some point or other. More often he wondered where he was and what time of day it was. At one moment he felt certain that it was broad daylight outside, and at the next, equally certain that it was pitch darkness. In this place he knew instinctively the lights would never be turned out. It was the place with no darkness. He saw now why O'Brien had seemed to recognize the illusion. In the ministry of the love, there were no windows. His cell might be at the heart of the building or against the outer wall. It might be 10 floors below ground or 30 above. He moved himself mentally from place to place and tried to determine by the feeling of his body whether he was perched high in the air or buried deep underground. There was a sound of marching boots outside. The steel door opened with a clang. A young officer, a trim black uniform figure who seemed to glitter all over with polished leather and whose pale, straight-featured face was like a wax mask, stepped smartly through the doorway. He motioned to the guards outside to bring in the prisoner they were leading. The poet Ampleforth shambled into the cell. The door clanged shut again. Ampleforth made one or two uncertain movements from side to side, as though having some idea that there was another door to go out of, and then began to wander up and down the cell. He had not yet noticed Winston's presence. His troubled eyes were gazing at the wall about a meter above the level of Winston's head. He was shoeless. Large, dirty toes were sticking out of the holes in his socks. He was also several days away from a shave. A scrubby beard covered his face to the cheekbone, giving him an air of ruffianism that went oddly with his large, weak frame and nervous movements. Winston roused himself a little from his lethargy. He must speak to Ampleforth and risk the yell from the telescreen. It was even conceivable that Ampleforth was the bearer of the razor blade. Ampleforth, he said. There was no yell from the telescreen. Ampleforth paused, mildly startled. His eyes focused themselves slowly on Winston. "Oh, Smith, you too. What are you in for?" "To tell you the truth." He sat down awkwardly on the bench opposite Winston. "There's only one offense, is there not?" he said. "And you have committed it?" "Apparently I have." He put a hand to his forehead and pressed his temples for a moment, as though trying to remember something. "These things happen," he said vaguely. "I've been able to recall one instance of possible, and since it was an indiscretion, undoubtedly, we were producing a definitive edition of the poems of Kipling. I allowed the word God to remain at the end of a line. I could not help it," he added, almost indignantly, raising his voice to look at Winston. "It was impossible to change the line. The rhyme was rod. Do you realize that there are only 12 rhymes to rod in the entire language? For days I was racked my brains. There was no other rhyme." The expression on his face changed. The annoyance passed out of it, and for a moment he looked almost pleased. A sort of intellectual warmth. The joy of the pedant who had found out some useless fact shone through the dirt and scrubby hair. "Has it ever occurred to you," he said, "the whole history of English poetry has been determined by the fact that the English language lacks rhymes?" No. The particular thought had never occurred to Winston, nor in the circumstances did it strike him as very important or interesting. "Do you know what time of day it is?" he said. Ampleforth looked startled again. "I'd hardly thought about it. They arrested me. It could have been 2 days ago, perhaps 3. His eyes fitted around the walls as though he half expected to find a window somewhere. "There's no difference between night and day in this place. I do not see how one can calculate the time." They talked desolatorily for some time, then, without apparent reason, a yell from the telescreen bade them to be silent. Winston sat quietly, his hands crossed. Ampleforth, too large to sit in comfort on the narrow bench, fidgeted from side to side, clasping his lank hands first round one knee, then round the other. The telescreen barked at him to keep still. Time passed. 20 minutes, an hour. It was difficult to judge. Once more, there was a sound of boots outside. Winston's entrails contracted. Soon, very soon, in 5 minutes perhaps, now, the tramp of boots would mean that his own turn had come. The door opened. The cold-faced young officer stepped into the cell. With a brief movement of hand, he indicated Ampleforth. Room 101, he said. Ampleforth marched clumsily out between the guards, his face vaguely perturbed but uncomprehending. What seemed like a long time passed. The pain in Winston's belly had revived. His mind sagged round and round on the same track, like a ball falling again and again into the same series of slots. He had only 6 thoughts: the pain in his belly, a piece of bread, the blood and the screaming, O'Brien, Julia, the razor blade. There was another spasm in his entrails. The heavy boots were approaching. As the door opened, the wave of the air that it created brought in a powerful smell of cold sweat. Parsons walked into the cell. He's wearing khaki shorts and a sports shirt. This time Winston was startled at his self-forgetfulness. You here? He said. Parsons gave Winston a glance in which there was neither interest or surprise, but only misery. He began walking jerkily up and down, evidently unable to keep still. Each time he straightened his pudgy knees, it was apparent that they were trembling. His eyes had a wide-open, staring look, as though he could not prevent himself from gazing at something in the middle distance. What are you in for? Said Winston. Thought crime, said Parsons, almost blubbering. The tone of his voice implied at once a complete admission of his guilt and a sort of incredulous horror that such a word could be applied to himself. He paused opposite Winston and began eagerly appealing to him. You don't think they'll shoot me, do you, old chap? They don't shoot you if you haven't actually done anything, only thoughts, which you can't help. I know they give you a fair hearing. Oh, I trust them for that. They'll know my record, won't they? You know what kind of a chap I was. Not a bad chap in my way. Not Brady, of course, but keen. I tried to do my best for the party, didn't I? I'll get off with 5 years, don't you think? Or even 10 years. A chap like me could make himself pretty useful to a labor camp. They wouldn't shoot me for going off the rails just once. Are you guilty? Said Winston. Of course I'm guilty, cried Winston with a servile glance at the telescreen. You don't think the party would arrest an innocent man, do you? His frog-like face grew calmer, and even took on a slightly sanctimonious expression. Thought crime is a dreadful thing, old man, he said sententiously. It's insidious. It can get a hold of you without your even knowing it. Do you know how it got a hold of me in my sleep? Yes, that's a fact. There it was, working away, trying to do my bit. Never knew I had any bad stuff in my mind at all, and then I started talking in my sleep. Do you know what they heard me saying? He sank his voice like someone who is obliged for medical reasons to utter an obscenity. Down with Big Brother. Yes, I said that. Said it over and over again, it seems. Between you and me, my old man. I'm glad they got me before it went any further. Do you know what I'm going to say to them when I get up before the tribunal? Thank you. I'm going to say thank you for saving me before it was too late. Who denounced you? Said Winston. It was my little daughter, said Parsons with a sort of doleful pride. She listened at the keyhole, heard what I was saying, and nipped off to the patrols the very next day. Pretty smart for a nipper of 7, eh? I don't bear her any grudge for it. In fact, I'm proud of her. Shows her brought her up in the right spirit anyway. He had made a few more jerky movements up and down, several times casting a longing glance at the lavatory pan. Then he suddenly ripped down his shorts. Excuse me, old man, he said. I can't help it. It's the waiting. He plumped his large posteriors over the lavatory pan. Winston covered his face with his hands. Smith, yelled the voice from the telescreen. 6079 Smith W. Uncover your face. No faces uncovered in the cells. Winston uncovered his face. Parsons used the lavatory, loudly and abundantly. It then turned out that the plug was defective and the cell stank abominably for hours afterwards. Parsons was removed. More prisoners came and went mysteriously. One, a woman, was consigned to room 101, and Winston noticed seemed to shrivel and turn a different color when she heard the words. The time came when, if it had been morning when he was brought here, it would be afternoon, or if it had been afternoon, then it would be midnight. There were 6 prisoners in the cell, men and women, all sat very still. Opposite Winston, there sat a man with a chinless, toothy face exactly like that of some large, harmless rodent. His fat, mottled cheeks were so at the bottom that it was difficult not to believe that he had little stores of food tucked away there. His pale gray eyes flitted timorously from face to face and turned quickly away again when he caught anyone's eye. The door opened and another prisoner was brought in, and whose appearance sent a momentary chill through Winston. He was a commonplace, mean-looking man who might have been an engineer or technician of some kind. But what was startling was the emaciation of his face. It was like a skull. Because of its thinness, the mouth and eyes looked disproportionately large, and the eyes seemed filled with a murderous, unappeasable hatred of somebody or something. The man sat down on the bench at a little distance from Winston. Winston did not look at him again, but the tormented skull-like face was so vivid in his mind as though it had been straight in front of his eyes. Suddenly he realized what was the matter. The man was dying of starvation. The same thought seemed to occur almost simultaneously to everyone in the cell. There was a very faint stirring all the way around the bench. The eyes of the chinless man kept flitting toward the skull-faced man, then turning guiltily away, then being dragged back to an irresistible attraction. Presently he began to fidget on his seat. At last he stood up, waddled clumsily across the cell, dug down into the pocket of his overalls, and with an abashed air held out a grimy piece of bread to the skull-faced man. There was a furious, deafening roar from the telescreen. The chinless man jumped in his tracks. The skull-faced man had quickly thrust his hands behind his back, as though demonstrating to all the world that he refused the gift. "Bumstead," roared the voice. 2713 Bumstead, J. Let fall that piece of bread. The chinless man dropped the piece of bread on the floor. "Remain standing where you are," said the voice. "Face the door. Make no movement." The chinless man obeyed. His large, pouchy cheeks were quivering uncontrollably. The door clanged open. As the young officer entered and stepped aside, there emerged from behind him a short, stumpy guard with enormous arms and shoulders. He took the stand opposite the chinless man, and then, at a signal from the officer, let free a frightful blow with all the weight of his body behind it, full in the chinless man's mouth. The forces that seemed almost to knock him clear off the floor. His body flung across the cell and fletched up against the base of the lavatory seat. For a moment he lay as though stunned, with dark blood oozing from his mouth and nose. A very faint whimpering or squeaking, which seemed unconscious, came out of him. Then he rolled over and raised himself unsteadily on hands and knees amid a stream of blood and saliva. The two halves of a dental plate fell out of his mouth. The prisoners sat very still, their hands crossed on their knees. The chinless man climbed back into his place. Down one side of his face, the flesh was darkening. His mouth had swollen into a shapeless cherry-colored mass with a black hole in the middle of it. From time to time, a little blood dripped onto the breast of his overalls. His gray eyes still flitted from face to face, more guiltily than ever, as though he were trying to discover how much the others despised him for his humiliation. The door opened. With a small gesture, the officer indicated the skull-faced man. "Room 101, he said. There was a gasp and a flurry at Winston's side. The man had actually flung himself on his knees on the floor with his hands clasped together. "Comrade! Officer," he cried. "You don't have to take me to that place. Haven't I told you everything already? What else is it you want to know? There's nothing I couldn't confess. Nothing. Just tell me what it is, and I'll confess it straight off. Write it down, and I'll sign it. Anything, not room 101. "Room 101, said the officer. The man's face, already pale, turned a color Winston would not have believed possible. It was definitely, unmistakably a shade of green. "Do anything to me! You've been starving me for weeks," he said. "Finish it off and let me die. Shoot me, hang me, sentence me to 25 years. If there's somebody else you can give away, just say who it is and I'll tell you anything you want. I don't care who it is or what you do to them. I've got a wife and 3 children. The biggest of them isn't 6 years old. You can take the whole lot of them and cut their throats in front of my eyes. I'll stand by and watch it, but not room 101. "Room 101, said the officer. The man looked frantically around at the other prisoners, as though it was some idea that he could put another victim in his own place. His eyes settled on the smashed face of the chinless man. He flung a lean arm. "That's the one you ought to be taking, not me," he shouted. "You didn't hear what he was saying after they bashed his face. Give me a chance, and I'll tell you every word of it. He's the one that's against the party, not me." The guard stepped forward. The man's voice rose to a shriek. "You didn't hear him. He repeated something went wrong with the telescreen. He's the one you want. Take him, not me." The 2 sturdy guards had stooped to take him by the arms. But just at this moment he flung himself across the floor of the cell and grabbed one of the iron legs that supported the bench. He'd set up a wordless howling like an animal. The guards took hold of him to wrench him loose, but he clung on with astonishing strength. For perhaps 20 seconds, they were hauling at him. The prisoners sat quiet, their hands crossed on their knees, looking straight in front of them. The howling stopped. The man had no breath left for anything except hanging on. There was a different kind of cry. A kick from a guard's boot had broken the fingers of one of his hands. They dragged him to his feet. Room 101, said the officer. The man was led out, walking unsteadily with head sunken, nursing his crushed hand. All the fight gone out of him. A long time passed. If it had been midnight when the skull-faced man was taken away, it was morning. If morning, it was afternoon. Winston was alone and had been alone for hours. The pain of sitting on the narrow bench was such that often he got up and walked about unreproved by the telescreen. A piece of bread still lay where the chinless man had dropped it. At the beginning, it needed a hard effort not to look at it, but presently hunger gave way to thirst. His mouth was sticky and evil-tasting. The humming sound and the unwavering white light induced a sort of faintness and empty feeling inside his head. He would get up because the ache in the bones was no longer bearable, and then he would sit down again almost at once because he was too dizzy to make sure of staying on his feet. Whenever his physical sensations were a little under control, the terror returned. Sometimes, with a fading hope, he thought of O'Brien and the razor blade. It's just thinkable that the razor blade might arrive concealed in his food, if he were ever fed. Or dimly he thought of Julia. Somewhere or other she was suffering, perhaps far worse than he. She might be screaming with pain at the moment, he thought. If I could save Julia by doubling my own pain, would I do it? Yes, I would. But that was merely an intellectual decision, taken because he knew that he ought to take it. He did not feel it. In this place, you could not feel anything except the pain and the foreknowledge of pain. Besides, was it possible when you were actually suffering it to wish for any reason whatever that your own pain should increase? But that question was unanswerable yet. The boots were approaching again. The door opened. O'Brien came in. Winston started to his feet. The shock of the sight had driven all caution out of him. For the first time in many years, he forgot the presence of the telescreen. "They've got you too?" he cried. "They got me a long time ago," said O'Brien with a mild, almost regretful irony. He stepped aside. From behind him they emerged a broad-chested guard with a long black truncheon in his hand. "You knew this, Winston," said O'Brien. "Don't deceive yourself. You did know it. You have always known it." Yes, he saw now. He had always known it. There was no time to think of that. All he had eyes for was the truncheon in the guard's hand. It might fall anywhere on the crown, on the tip of the ear, on the upper arm, on the elbow. The elbow! He had slumped to his knees, almost paralyzed, clasping the stricken elbow with the other hand. Everything had exploded in a yellow light. Inconceivable! Inconceivable that one blow could cause such pain! The light cleared, and he could see the other two looking down at him. The guard was laughing at his contortions. One question at any rate was answered. Never for any reason on earth could you wish for an increase of pain. Of pain you could wish only one thing, that it would stop. Nothing in the world was so bad as physical pain. In the face of pain, there are no heroes. No heroes, he thought over and over as he writhed on the floor, clutching uselessly at the disabled left arm. I will tell you the truth. I have never gotten emotional like that reading this book, and I can't tell you how many times I've read this book. So chapter 10 starts with Julia and Winston waking up after a beautiful evening. There's some beautiful, beautiful imagery in chapter 10, which I think George Orwell sets up as a bit of irony to be juxtaposed to what's going to happen next in the chapter. When he says, As he fastened the belt of his overalls, he strolled across to the window. The sun must have gone down behind the houses. It was not shining into the yard any longer. The flagstones were not wet as though they had just been washed. And he had the feeling that the sky had been washed too, so the fresh and pale was the blue between the chimney pots. Tirelessly, the woman marched to and fro, corking and uncorking herself, singing and falling silent, and pegging out one more diaper and more yet. I mean, it's just beautiful, beautiful imagery. It had never before occurred to him that the body of a woman of 50, blown up to monstrous dimensions by childbearing, then hardened and roughened by work till it was coarse in the grain of an overripe turnip, could be so beautiful. And at the end of it, she was still singing after the end of all the things that she has gone through. And then he goes on to say that it was curious to think that the sky was the same for everybody. And the people under the sky were also very much the same, everywhere, all over the world. People just like this, people ignorant of one another's existence, held apart by walls of hatred and lies, and yet almost exactly the same. People who had never learned to think, but were storing up in their hearts and bellies the muscles, the power that would one day overturn the world. If there was hope, it lay in the proles. The birds sang, the proles sang. The party did not sing. Gosh, it's just beautiful. Amazing writing. And then he says, "We are dead." And Julia says, "We are the dead." And then, "You are the dead." The iron voice. I mean, the fact that the telescreen was behind the picture in the room, that she almost moved away to see if there were bugs or rats behind it. And I wanted to bring that up whenever that scene came up, but I couldn't give away the plot. It would have been spoilers, but man. Then it goes on the line, "The feeling of nakedness with one's hands behind one's head and one's face and body all exposed was almost unbearable." The guard grabs the paperweight and crashes it on the floor. Beautiful symbolism when he realizes how small Winston thought, how small it always was. The piece of coral, the symbol of hope, the symbol of beauty, the symbol of importance, so tiny inside that glass. Then the last line in that paragraph. I mean, when Julia is beaten and he has to watch it, God, that ripped my heart out. And he says that was the last he saw of her. He wondered whether, after all, he and Julia had mistaken the time. He slept through around the next morning, but he couldn't think about that anymore because it wasn't interesting. And then when Mr. Charrington walks in, and he was the spy, he was the one that had double-crossed. Was it all a setup? I mean, one of the beautiful things about good writing is they leave some questions for you that never get answered. Not questions that drive you crazy, but questions that allow your mind to try to connect pieces. This reminds me a lot of, if you have or have not read The Handmaid's Tale. Margaret Atwood wrote a follow-up book to that. It was just published within the last 5 years, called Testaments. And it details some of the events of when things started to go south, before Gilead took over, or as Gilead was taking over. And it details, I'm not going to give any spoilers, but it does detail a scene that haunts me. There's a handful of scenes in all of literature that haunt me, and this is one of them. And I think one of the reasons I got caught up in the emotion of this is, in reading it, it reminded me so much of that vivid scene in Testaments. And those two scenes together just seemed so poignant. Part 3, Chapter 1. There's so much in this chapter. My favorite book ever written is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Les Miserables. And so, of course, whenever Winston is called 6079 Smith W., my mind goes to 24601, the number of Jean Valjean. Those of you who were in my class before, you've had to listen to me sing that, I'm sure. But, he details the different cell that they put him in. This woman, again, pardon my accent, it was probably atrocious, but this woman with great tumbling breasts is thrown on top of him and pukes on the floor right in front of him, and then puts her arm around him and realizes This could have been his mother. I'll never know if it was her, but it very well could have been. All these different people that Winston knows are brought in. There's Ampleforth, there's Parsons. Who knows? Are they set up? Were they arrested because Winston was arrested? Were they put in that room to see if Winston would confess? Ampleforth is just delirious, trying to figure out what happened. Parsons walks in. Parsons is in a complete panic, but because he is the party. He is what they want him to be, and he's so brainwashed that he's proud of his daughter for catching him to prevent him from becoming a true rebel. Parsons has to use the bathroom in the corner, and Winston has to just sit there and listen to it. And it says, Parsons, you just the lavatory loudly and abundantly. And of course, it wouldn't flush, so the cells stink abominably for hours afterwards. It's called comic relief. I mean, a good writer is going to drop in something for you to chuckle at in the midst of such horror and devastation. Because right after that, we get into this god awful scene where you have a man who's being starved to death. You have another man who comes and tries to give him some bread, and then that man is beaten so much that his dental plate falls out of his mouth. And then the man who's been starved and abused gets beaten and dragged out of the room to the point where he's offering up his family to be murdered in front of him if they'll won't torture him anymore. And that's psychological torture, right? Because that leaves everyone else in the room so afraid of room 101. And then Winston's one hope comes in, O'Brien. And he finds out, both in a physical blow and an emotional blow, and who knows which one was worse, that O'Brien was the one that set him up.